I still keep the receipt from that morning. Not because I need proof, I know what I found, but because some days I need to hold something real in my hands to remind myself it actually happened. It's a receipt from a Walgreens on Maple Avenue, dated a Tuesday in March, 2 weeks after my husband's funeral. I had gone in to buy trash bags and came out with trash bags and a new understanding of the last 31 years of my life. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I didn't cry at the funeral. I stood at the graveside in my black wool coat, the one my daughter said made me look like I was going to a board meeting, and I watched them lower the casket, and I felt nothing, not relief, not grief, not even the low, tired sadness I had expected to feel. The kind that comes when something long and difficult finally ends. Just nothing, like static on a television after the channel goes off the air. My son was standing next to me. He kept glancing over, waiting, I think, for me to reach for his hand or start to cry or do something that looked like a widow at her husband's burial. I didn't. I watched the flowers on top of the casket and thought about whether I had turned the crock pot off before we left the house. I had been married to my husband for 31 years. His name was Gerald. Gerald Raymond Cook. He had been an accountant for most of his working life, then a financial consultant for the last decade before he retired, and he had a way of making every room feel slightly smaller than it was. Not loudly. He wasn't a loud man. He was the kind of man who made you feel the walls closing in very quietly, so quietly that you spent 20 years thinking the problem was you. We met when I was 28. I was teaching third grade at an elementary school in Columbus, Ohio, and he was the brother of a woman I worked with. He was 12 years older than me, which seemed distinguished at the time. He wore press shirts and remembered details: your coffee order, your mother's birthday, the name of your childhood dog. People said he was attentive. I thought he was attentive. I thought he was lucky. We married 18 months after we met. I wore my mother's earrings and cried at the altar and meant every word of it. The changes were so slow I never saw them as changes at all. They looked like love. They looked like a husband who cared. He didn't like me driving long distances alone. There was too much traffic, he said. The highways weren't safe. He'd rather take me himself. And at first I let him, because it was easier, because he offered, because what harm could it do? But then, it wasn't long distances. It was the grocery store if the weather looked uncertain. It was my sister's house if it was getting dark. And then one day I realized I hadn't driven myself anywhere in 3 years, and didn't know how to bring that up without starting a conversation. I didn't have the energy for. He came to my doctor's appointments. Every single one. He said he liked to be informed, liked to be able to ask the right questions, liked to make sure I understood what the doctors were telling me. The first few times, my doctor seemed pleased to have such an engaged spouse. Later, I noticed she had started addressing her answers to him rather than to me. I noticed, and I filed it away in a drawer I had gotten very good at keeping closed. When my mother got sick, I wanted to go stay with her for a week in Cleveland. He said, of course, he'd drive me up on Friday. I said I'd like to go alone, take the car, have some time on the road to think. He said, "You know how you get anxious on long drives, sweetheart." He said it kindly, gently, so gently that I second-guessed whether I did, in fact, get anxious on long drives. I let him drive me. I sat in the passenger seat for 3 hours and stared out the window and visited my dying mother as a passenger in my own life. That's the sentence that came to me much later. A passenger in my own life. Gerald died of a heart attack on a Tuesday evening in January. He was 71. He had seemed fine at dinner. He complained of shoulder pain around 9 o'clock, and by the time the ambulance arrived, he was gone. Just like that. 31 years of marriage, and then a Tuesday evening, and then nothing. I called my daughter. She drove through the night from Pittsburgh to be with me. My son flew in from Portland the next morning. We arranged the funeral, we called the relatives, we received the casseroles and the flower arrangements, and the somber handshakes. I moved through it all like a woman underwater. It was my daughter who first mentioned the office. "Mom," she said, the morning after the funeral, "we're going to need to go through Dad's papers at some point. For the estate." I knew what she meant. I had never been in Gerald's office. Not in this house, and not in the house before it. He had always had an office, and the office had always been his. The door was always closed. It was locked most evenings. I had asked about it once, early on, and he had explained that he kept client files in there, confidential materials. It was just simpler to keep the space separate. I had accepted that the way I accepted so many things. Quietly, without quite knowing I was accepting anything at all. "I'll get to it," I told my daughter. She exchanged a look with my son that they thought I didn't see. The day after they both went home, I stood in the hallway outside the office door for a long time. It was a gray February morning. I had a cup of coffee in my hand that had gone cold. I stood there, and I thought about all the times I had walked past this door in 11 years in this house. All the times I had heard him in there on the phone. All the times I had knocked to say dinner was ready and waited for him to unlock it from the inside before I handed him his plate. He had kept the key on his keychain. I found his keys in the bowl by the front door, where I had put them the night he died. I stood there with my cold coffee, and I looked at the door, and then I went and got the keys. The lock turned on the first try. The room smelled like him, that specific smell of his. Old paper, the cedar of his closet, the particular brand of soap he had used for as long as I had known him. For a moment, just a moment, something moved in my chest that might have been grief. Then I turned on the light. It was a regular office. A desk, bookshelves, a filing cabinet, a leather chair, a small window looking out at the backyard. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that screamed anything at all. I set down my coffee on the corner of his desk, and I started with the bookshelves. Most of it was what I expected: financial texts, tax code references, a few novels I recognized from years ago that had apparently migrated in here. Then I pulled out a gray binder that had no label on the spine. Inside were documents I had never seen, medical records, mine, going back 15 years to a different doctor than my current one, a doctor I had stopped seeing when Gerald suggested I switch to someone closer to the house. My records from that doctor, whom I had liked, whom I had felt comfortable with, were in Gerald's gray binder in Gerald's locked office, and I had no memory of signing anything to give him access to them. I sat down in his leather chair. I kept reading. There was a section with financial statements, accounts I did not recognize. A brokerage account opened in 2009 in Gerald's name only. A savings account at a bank on the east side of the city, not our bank, a bank where I had never had any business. Statements going back years. Balances that, I had to look twice. Balances that made my hands go still on the pages. We had always lived comfortably. Gerald handled the finances. He gave me a household account for groceries and utilities and whatever I needed, and I never thought to question it, because we never seemed to want for anything, and he always said we were fine. Just fine, being careful, watching the retirement funds. You know how it is. I knew how it was. I knew what I had been told. I sat in that chair for a long time. The gray morning light came through the window and moved across the floor as the hours passed, and I sat in my dead husband's chair in my dead husband's locked office, and I read every page of every document in that binder. And then I opened the filing cabinet, and I read those too. There was a life insurance policy I had known about. There were two I had not. There was a deed to our house. My name was not on it. I had assumed for 11 years that my name was on the deed to my own home. I had never thought to check. Why would I check? There was a document from an attorney I had never heard of dated 2014, establishing a revocable living trust. The trust held the house, the brokerage account, and several other assets. The trust named a beneficiary I did not recognize, a name that meant nothing to me, a woman's name. A first and last name typed neatly on the line where I might have expected to see my own. I closed the filing cabinet very carefully, the way you close a door when you don't want to wake someone sleeping. Then I sat back down, and I thought about my marriage. I thought about the appointments he had always attended. I thought about the way he had answered for me, not rudely, never rudely, but consistently, reliably, until the doctor stopped waiting for my answer. I thought about the driving, the household account with its monthly allowance, the way he reviewed the statements, the way I had never seen a tax return. I thought about how my sister had stopped calling as often after Gerald mentioned once that she seemed to stir me up, and I had brushed it off, and now I hadn't spoken to my sister in 4 years, and I couldn't remember exactly how that had happened. I thought about the friends I had lost track of, the teachers' union committee I had stepped back from because Gerald thought the meetings ran too late, the watercolor class I had signed up for once and then not gone back to after he pointed out how much the supplies cost. I thought about my daughter's face when she asked about the office, about the look she and my son had exchanged. They had known something was wrong for a long time. They had been waiting, I understood now, for me to find my way to knowing it too. I called my daughter that evening. I didn't tell her everything, not yet. I just said, I went through the office. I think I need an attorney. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I'll be there Friday, Mom. The attorney was a woman named, I'll call her my attorney, because in this story she becomes almost a character in her own right. She was sharp and calm, and she wore reading glasses that she took off and put back on about 40 times in the first hour I knew her. She sat across from me in a conference room with the documents I had brought, and she read through them without speaking, and I watched her face for clues. How much of this did you know about? She asked. None of it, I said. She put her glasses back on. Okay, she said. Let's start at the beginning. The beginning, as it turned out, was more complicated and more expensive than Gerald had led me to believe, and that was saying something because Gerald had led me to believe our finances were modest and careful and oriented entirely toward our shared retirement. The brokerage account alone held an amount that made my attorney take her glasses off again and set them on the table. He kept this separate for how long? She asked. I found statements going back to 2009, I said, but I don't know when it started. She nodded slowly. She made notes. I told her about the trust. I told her about the beneficiary I didn't recognize. She made more notes, and then she typed something into her laptop and looked at it for a long moment without showing me the screen. I think, she said, we need to have a frank conversation about what your options are. The options were more than I had expected. Gerald's estate, as it turned out, was subject to Ohio probate law, and the way the trust had been structured. And she explained this to me carefully, checking to make sure I was following, not answering for me the way Gerald would have. The way it had been structured created some legal questions that, in her opinion, could be argued in my favor. The marriage itself, the length of it, the nature of the financial arrangement, the fact that I had been kept from information that directly affected my welfare, all of it was relevant. The woman named in the trust, I eventually found out, was someone Gerald had known for many years. It was not a romantic situation, as far as anyone could determine. She was the adult daughter of a college friend, a young woman he had apparently been quietly supporting for years, putting her through school, helping with a down payment on an apartment, sending money at intervals that showed up in the statements as cash withdrawals I had never questioned, because I had never seen the statements. I don't know what their relationship was exactly. I don't know that I need to. What I know is that money left our marriage without my knowledge for at least 15 years, and my name was stripped from my own home, and my medical records were filed in a locked room I was never invited into. My daughter came to every attorney meeting. She sat next to me and took notes in a yellow legal pad. Sometimes she reached over and put her hand on my arm, not to stop me from speaking, but to let me know she was there. It was the opposite of everything I had lived with for 31 years, and it nearly undid me every time. My son flew back out twice. He was angrier than my daughter, more vocal about it, wanted to understand how this had happened, kept asking questions that the attorney would answer patiently, and then I could see him working through his own accounting of his father. That accounting was its own kind of grief, I think. Not for me. For him. Losing a father is hard enough. Losing a father and then having to reconstruct who that father actually was, that's something I wouldn't wish on anyone. The legal process took 14 months. I will not say it was simple. It was not. There were days I drove myself home from the attorney's office. I had started driving myself again, had taken the car out alone one morning just to do it, and felt something loosen in my chest at the first intersection. There were days I drove home and went directly to bed and lay there listening to the house and trying to figure out what I actually knew about my own life. That accounting took a long time. Some of it I am still doing. What I found out slowly, in pieces, the coercive control I had experienced had a name. I had not known it had a name. I found a book my daughter left on my kitchen counter one afternoon, and I read it over 3 nights, and it was like reading a description of a room I had lived in for decades without ever having a word for what it was. The isolation, incremental. The financial opacity, by design. The medical appointments attended without my genuine consent, my voice replaced by his until I stopped expecting to use it. None of it had required raised voices or locked doors between us. Most of it had looked, from the outside and from the inside, like consideration, like love. That's the part that took the longest to metabolize. Not the money. The money was its own injury, and a significant one, and I am still working through what it means for the life I have now. But the money I could count. I could put it in a column, present it to an attorney, have it addressed in a courtroom. What I couldn't put in a column was the 31 years of small, quiet surrenders. The teachers' union committee, the watercolor class, the long drives I had stopped taking, my sister's voice on the phone, which I had not heard in 4 years. I called my sister the week after the estate settled. She answered on the second ring. I said, "It's me." She said, "I know." There was a long pause that held a lot of years in it, and then she said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "I'm getting there." And she said, "Tell me everything." So I did. The estate settled 14 months after Gerald died. I won't go into all the details because some of them are still too close and some of them are not mine alone to share. What I will say is that when I walked out of that courthouse, I was standing on ground that belonged to me in a way nothing had for a very long time. The house deed has my name on it now. The accounts I know about. The doctor I see now speaks directly to me, asks me questions and waits for my answers. I kept the office. I thought about turning it into a guest room or a craft room, or just emptying it out entirely. Instead, I put a comfortable chair in the corner and some bookshelves with my own books, and a table for my watercolor things, which I started again last spring. I go in there in the mornings with my coffee. I open the window. I sit in the light. I am 64 years old. I drive myself everywhere. I have started, slowly, to notice when I default to silence in a conversation and ask myself whether I actually have nothing to say or whether I am just out of the habit of speaking. More often than not, I have something to say. It turns out I have quite a lot to say. I still keep that receipt from Walgreens. Trash bags and a Tuesday morning and a walk back to a car that I drove home by myself. I keep it in the top drawer of the desk in what used to be Gerald's office, in what is now just a room in my house. A room with a window and a chair and a small jar of water with a paintbrush resting in it. Colors bleeding slowly into the water, turning it a soft and imprecise blue. Some silences end quietly. Some end all at once. Mine ended on a Tuesday, with a key that turned on the first try, in a room that had always been there, waiting for me to walk into it. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this happened. Not in any grand cosmic sense, just the plain, ordinary mechanics of it. How one small surrender leads to another, and how you don't notice because each one is so reasonable on its own. Gerald didn't build a cage overnight. He built it one thoughtful gesture at a time, and I walked in willingly because it looked like safety. That's the part I had to sit with the longest. Not anger at him, though there was some of that, but the harder question. How did I let myself become someone who stopped asking questions? I think the honest answer is that I didn't know I had. That's what coercive control does. It doesn't feel like control while you're inside it. It feels like a marriage. It feels like a marriage. It feels like compromise and consideration and not wanting to make things difficult. You give up the teachers' union committee because it runs late and the commute is tiring anyway. You stop taking solo drives because he worries. You let the watercolors go because the supplies are expensive and you weren't that serious about it. None of those things alone looks like erasure, but you add them up over 31 years and you get a woman standing at her husband's gravesite feeling nothing, not even knowing why. What I know now is that moral clarity, real clarity, not the kind that comes from rules or instruction, but the kind that comes from paying attention, requires practice. It requires you to keep asking, whose voice is this? Is this what I actually think? Or is it what I've been steered toward thinking? Gerald was smart. He was patient, but his intelligence was spent in service of his own interests at the expense of mine, and that, in the end, is its own kind of poverty. You can accumulate assets in a locked room your whole life and still leave the world having built nothing that lasts. My daughter sat with me through 14 months of legal proceedings and never once made me feel foolish for not having seen it sooner. That's what real steadiness looks like. Not the soft-spoken management Gerald called love, but someone sitting next to you with a yellow legal pad, taking notes, making sure your voice gets heard. I think about that distinction often. There is a version of care that diminishes you quietly, and a version that holds space for you to grow back into yourself. Learning to tell the difference, I think, is one of the more important things a person can do. I am 64. I started the watercolors again last spring. I drive myself everywhere. Some mornings I sit in what used to be Gerald's office, and I think about the years I spent walking past that locked door and accepting the explanation I was given. I don't spend too long there. The window is good in the morning, and the light comes in clean and even, and there's a jar of water on the table going slowly blue, and that is enough. That is, in fact, quite a lot. The key turned on the first try. I think it always would have,